Sure. So my name is Samira Qureshi, and my pronouns are she, her, hers. And I consider myself to be a sexual health educator.
Ooh. How long have you been a sexual health educator?
So I think around 10 to 12 years. It's hard to know exactly when it started because I kind of fell into the field. But I would say from around 2010 onwards,
Oh,
formally, I was doing that.
how did you find your way into this role?
Yeah, it's a bit of an interesting story. My background is an occupational therapist, and I worked in schools in Canada. So my goal was working with kids with special needs. And then there was this mental health project within the Muslim community there. And so I started teaching about mental health and soon realized that a lot of middle school and high school kids were dealing with sexual health issues. Sex ed wasn't happening in those schools because it's a religious setting. And so I started working with a professional in the area to develop content and facilitate it. And from there, it's the history kind of wrote itself in terms of I dove into it full time and really, really enjoyed it.
Mm. So, as a Muslim, how has your journey to being a sex therapist educator, how have you kind of destigmatized sex? Or how is sex perceived? Let me ask that. How is sex perceived in your culture? And then we'll talk about how you had to kind of just figure it out for yourself as you started to journey into this career.
Yeah, that's a great question, one that's often asked. And the answer is pretty complicated. We know that there's a vast diversity of Muslims in North America,
Mhm.
everything from African Americans to Black and South Asian to Arab to converts, Latinx folks. So there isn't really one way it's perceived, but there are general trends that we notice. So, for example, I'm South Asian myself, immigrant community. There's a lot of shame around sex, and it's not always openly spoken about. So a lot of the work I'm doing is bringing those conversations to light and really working on getting rid of the shame that exists. In other communities, such as those that are perhaps used to having sex ed, African American and Black folks have shared that the shame doesn't exist in the same way. Conversations have been happening, perhaps. And then it's more about having more nuanced conversations that maybe focus on pleasure, for example, if we're talking about sex and intimacy. So there's a range of how sex and sexuality is seen. And what's interesting is people often attribute those reasons to Islam itself, when we actually know that it's not the faith tradition that has shame within it, it's the result of colonization. When we look at traditional Islamic teachings and spirituality, sex was spoken about openly in terms of societies and giving people support when they needed it. It's only through colonization, thanks to European communities of Islamic countries and then sweeping to the West, that we're finding that Islam has taken a form that wasn't the way it was. And that's really why we're seeing so much of the stigma and shame around sex.
Hmm. So did you grow up with that same shame and stigma about sex?
You know, when I reflect back, I don't think it was on my mind much because I didn't have exposure to those conversations or learnings myself. I never received sex ed growing up. So to me, it wasn't like I was missing anything because it didn't really exist if there was no language or conversation around it. It was only in my 20s when I started working in the field that I realized, oh, I think there might have been some fear. A lot of parents have fear around exposing their kids to those conversations because they think, oh my God, it's going to make them curious. And also, Muslim parents want their kids to remain Muslim. So they're worried about what those conversations might do, right? Like, oh, we're going to introduce them to these, quote, Western ideas. So I think that's where a lot of the fear comes from, good intentioned parents of wanting to shelter. And that's what I think happened to me. And my mom to this day says, I've learned so much from you. I didn't have the language back then to understand how to teach you. I also was in the realm of raising three kids. And so there was this overwhelmed feeling of immigrating. The focus is on, providing. And really, how do we give parents the language and support they need to take care of their own sexual health before they're able to share it with their kids? And that's where I think compassionately understand where a lot of parents come from.
Oh, I love that. I love that. So sometimes along our journey of sexual liberation, sometimes I think one of the things I love about Oscillium is it almost gives us a permission to explore and be okay and destigmatize that if our parents didn't give us that. But if we are empowered by places like a Wellcelium, then we can hopefully empower our parents. Do you agree with that?
100%. I really agree. I think having compassion and empathy for past generations or even ourselves with where we're at, I often say there's a reason why we're where we're at with our sexuality. Um, I think understanding that and trying to figure out what factors influenced it, how lack of exposure, mostly not of our own fault, right, to education plays a large part. And so if we're able to embrace and have compassion for our history, I think that lends to more healthier moving forward, which is what you're all trying to do with the platform you're providing, is really holding a lot of space for these important conversations and learnings to happen.
Mm-hmm. I agree. What type of classes will you be teaching?
So what I've found over the last decade is a lot of service providers and professionals in the sexuality, sex ed field have exposure to Muslims, whether it's students in their classes, clients that they're counseling, or groups that they're working with. And there's also a vast misunderstanding of kind of Islam itself and then what Muslims may need around sex and sexuality. So we're going to be exploring Islamic perspectives on sex and sexuality. We're going to be taking a really cool decolonized approach to understanding it. We're going to uplift a lot of traditional teachings. And therefore, we're kind of giving a landscape of what sex could be in different Muslim spaces. So it's not cultural sensitivity training. This is not a one size fit all toolkit, which you're just going to take and cookie cutter apply to your Muslim clients. It's more about let's add nuance into the conversation. Let's give you information. Let's give you different approaches to use values when you're working with Muslims around sex ed, because values are really important when we think about religious communities. So it's about giving different approaches and different tools that folks can use in their work with Muslims.
I love that. Now, to attend, do you have to be a Muslim in order to attend?
No, I would really encourage those who don't identify as Muslim to attend. I'm sure some Muslims will attend, but what I've noticed is mostly it's non-Muslim professionals who are serving Muslim communities and clients. And so some Muslims actually prefer their provider to not be Muslim because there's a lot of, again, shame, right? Also trust issues because communities can be really tight-knit. So this workshop is for everyone and all folks, whether you identify as being Muslim or if you don't. I find people walk away feeling like, wow, I did not know this. And there's a lot of unlearning that often needs to happen.
Could you share with me some of those light bulb moments that you've helped to help someone unpack and see differently?
Yeah, I think a really common one is this understanding that sex and sexuality in Islam are sacred and very spiritual practices. So oftentimes in our society, sex is seen as something physical and emotional in nature, and the spiritual and sacred is not there. And because there's just not an understanding of what that means. So, we take a look at what his Islamic tradition taught us in terms of the sacred and spiritual with sex and sexuality. So that's something that I think a lot of people kind of have light bulb moments go off and have said, I didn't really consider asking or exploring that perspective with my client or with myself if I'm Muslim. I didn't really put those two together. I think another thing is that we are sexual beings from birth to death. And I think that's something that a lot of folks don't often think about. It's not that we're sexually active, but, God created us in a certain way. And so for Muslims to hear that there is a sacred reason for the way that our bodies, our emotions, our sexuality has been created, it gives us permission that the more we know about ourselves, we're actually on a spiritual journey. Sexuality is part of that. And so I think those two are pivotal moments that I've heard both Muslims and non-Muslims kind of say, oh, wow, I didn't really think about that because of all the erroneous information that's out there about Islam overall.
Mm-hmm. If you could just move your work forward, we'll say 50 years from now, and different generations are coming behind you, what would you want to see?
Oh, my biggest wish is that every Muslim has access to online comprehensive sex ed. And that's something I'm working towards starting next year, is just information when you need it and hopefully before you need it. Like I want us to have information downstream. I'm really frustrated with the kind of reactionary way in which Muslims are getting sex ed. It's like, I have a problem. Where's the information? Where are the services? I want it to be like downstream. And for providers, I would love there to be like this kind of values-based spirituality infused into sex education work. I know I saw some of that in Canada, where values are very important when we talk about sex and sexuality. I would love for there to be more frameworks around sex ed that take that into account. You know, we use the word intersectionality, we use the word identity. Spirituality is a part of that. You know, for Muslims, that means relationship with God. For others, it might mean relationship with the universe or some sort of, you know, purpose for being on earth. And I would love to see that more infused into sex ed. I think we're missing that piece when we talk about intersectional sex ed.
What are some of the issues? I guess from what I'm understanding, parents may have good intentions, but they shelter them. So how does that prohibit the child from having, I guess, some sense of sexual identity and intelligence, I guess?
Yeah, we're seeing it in relationships and marriages, especially. You know, sex is a form of worship within marriage, Islamically. And so we're also noticing a lot of couples struggling with communicating about intimacy, understanding sex, understanding their bodies, you know, what accelerates desire and arousal, what decelerates it. So that's the result of not having sexual health literacy, is that it's almost like you don't have language to talk about what's happening or what could be within yourselves and also with a partner. So the consequence of not getting sex ed when you're younger is like you don't have awareness of even what is a healthy baseline for sexual health, right? Basic physical wellness stuff, all the way to how do I communicate to my partner what's pleasurable to me and what's not so pleasurable? How do we communicate that I'm emotionally overwhelmed and actually don't feel like having sex tonight? Muslims can do that within marriage, and yet many think that it's not possible. So it's almost like the realm of possibility shrinks down, where sex is just a physical act when it's so much more than that. And so sex ed will hopefully give Muslims the full range of possibilities and understandings to be able to talk and live and experience healthy sexuality.
I can imagine being a Muslim woman or just a Muslim and feeling such a like a relief, knowing that if I don't experience sex as a act of service to God, but I can actually not do it or say, hey, I actually just want to get off, you know, because
Yeah.
like I can only imagine that relief, you know, how that would feel.
I've heard that quite a bit, that, you know, Muslims are grateful for spaces to talk about this, to ask questions, to understand that, like you said, like there's possibilities there. And of course, you know, every religion has certain teachings, and it's up to that individual. It's kind of like their relationship between them and God, whatever they decide to do with their sexualities between them. It's more about like, let's give you language to understand. And also for health and safety perspectives, right? There's fundamental information that all individuals should have. So you're right, just having space to have language and to process and to reflect and to internalize. Sex and sexuality are complicated, and I think we often reduce it down to very simplistic ideas.
I think I can only imagine as a married woman, I'm relieved knowing if I don't supply my husband with sex, he's not going to leave me. It's like, oh, okay. So I couldn't imagine what it feels like when there's like this whole weight of like God involved in that. You know what I'm saying? I can only imagine like, oh, okay, so you're not going to leave me if we don't do it tonight. Oh, thank God. You know?
That's right. Or, oh, you know, God won't punish me if I say to my spouse, you know, not tonight, and this is why. Let's talk about ways in which I can ensure that I'm feeling good about us sharing sexual intimacy. You know, that's the thing. Like, Islam is not the dogmatic faith that a lot of people think it is. There's very few things that are hard rules. The rest is said to have been given to a mercy to given as a mercy to us as Muslims. So it's just empowering people with the skills and the knowledge is a large part of why I do this work, because I think it does lend to our relationship with God if we're able to explore our sexual selves.
So I think from hearing your story that I kind of see how you ended up being a part of this. It's like, whoa, there's this really huge need and this gap. I've got the experience. Let me see how I can help.
Absolutely. And it's funny, I feel like my own personal trajectory has often informed the work that I do. And so, initially I identified as a survivor. And so I did a lot of sexual violence prevention work. And that was the reason for why I did the work. It's only been this year that, after a great amount of time and effort, that I feel like I am who I am right now and feeling healed and whole. Then now I'm like switching to the spiritual perspective. I think this is something that everyone can benefit from. And so that's the angle I really think is important to have, because oftentimes we know that sex is fear-based, it's abstinence-based, and there's so much damage, as that's done when it's approached that way. So spiritual perspectives, I feel like, open up the conversation in such a beautiful way.
It does. It does. Do I need to be an educator, a therapist, or a service provider to attend your workshop?
Not at all. When pre-COVID, when I was in a lot of conferences and traveling to do this work with a nonprofit that I previously worked with, people would come solely for the reason of wanting a space to learn about Islam. I think given the climate that we're in, Islam has received a lot of attention, and it's not always the right kind of attention. So I often find myself answering questions about the faith tradition that maybe don't have to do with sex and sexuality, but are very tied to it. So I encourage anyone who's curious about Islam, about Muslims, about exploring spirituality, about sex ed, even aspects of mental health that ties to sexuality. This workshop is such a good place to start changing some of your knowledge and maybe giving you a bit more food for thought on the topic.
Why do you think a place like Wesleyan is so important?
When I heard about Wesleyan, it was about 4 months ago now, and just browsing the website and seeing what was provided, it was really reassuring, because it felt like this conversation of sex and sexuality is broad, and that different identities, communities, different perspectives fit into Wesleyan's approach and in their purpose and vision. It's not often that people are like, come as you are with the way you're teaching about sex and sexual health. We are a platform, do what you do, and we're going to help you bring people. So I think that's what appealed to me. It's like, oh, it's an, instant validation, and also uplifting this notion of intersectionality, diversity, and exploring different perspectives. I think that type of a platform is really rare. And so I as I've said from the beginning of meeting folks from Wesleyan, I'm just really honored and blessed that I have this platform.